Welcome to Grail Country. We have two special guests with us tonight here in the Grail Country studio. We have Jordan Daniel Wood and Chris Green, who I am happy to number amongst my friends and who happen to also be very gifted theologians. With the subject of our conversation tonight, I entitled it God is Not a Master, Deconstructing the Idolatry of Power. And the God is not a master part was inspired by the title of one of Chris Green's excellent sermons. I've linked that sermon in the show notes, so if you want to check out Chris's sermon for context, feel free to do so. And then I just kind of have on the deconstructing the idolatry of power part, I kind of have a little bit of an introduction to the topic. This is taken from this is an excerpt from letter 4 of Meditations on the Tarot by Valentin Tomberg. He writes this. He says, "Now there are open and secret worshippers of the idol of power, for it is an idol and the source of all idolatry, also in Christian factions or in religious and spiritual circles in general. Here there are two categories: those who aspire to the ideal of the Superman, and those who believe in a God that is actually almighty and therefore responsible for all that happens. The worship of the idol of power, conceived as the Superman, above all when one identifies oneself with it, is relatively inoffensive, being fundamentally infantile. But this is not so with the other category of power worshippers, namely those who project this ideal onto God himself. Their faith in God depends only on the power of God. If God was powerless, they would not believe in him. It is they who teach that God has created souls predestined to eternal damnation and others predestined to salvation. It is they who make God responsible for the entire history of the human race, including all its atrocities. God, they say, chastises his disobedient children by means of wars, revolutions, tyrannies, and other similar things. How could it be otherwise? God is almighty, therefore all that happens is only able to happen through his action or with his consent. The idol of power has such a hold on some human minds that they prefer a God who is a mixture of good and evil, provided that he is powerful, to a God of love who governs only by the intrinsic authority of the divine, by truth, beauty, and goodness. I.e., they prefer a God who is actually almighty to the crucified God." Thoughts?
Come on, Chris.
Oh, I mean, what an astounding passage! I've yet to read any of it, so I'm just kind of in awe. I think that's right. I don't know what else to say other than
say yes.
I think we
High five.
we cut the live stream. We did it. Like that's. I mean, I guess all I would add to that is I think there's a long line, a really long line of Christian theologians who've made that point actually, in one way or another, and insisted. I don't think you can be true to Jesus and not insist that second account, that when we talk about God as all powerful, what we really mean is he has the kind of power we wish for ourselves, just maximalized. Yeah. That is an idol. That is the idol of all idols.
I mean, the idol of idols is what Tomberg says, and I think he nails it there. And it's interesting. This is, I think, there's something we missed that's kind of seems to me should be obvious to us, right? If we really, really believe that Christianity is different from all the other religions that have ever existed before in the history of the earth, then that should actually make us be able to see this pattern, because that projection of God as just a more powerful version of what we desire for ourselves is what essentially every religion prior to Christianity essentially instituted, Like that's that the relation the relationship between God and humans was always a master slave relationship. That the idea that the relationship between God and his creation is a master slave relationship that's ancient Near Eastern despotism. That's paganism. That's nothing to do like that. That's specifically what Christianity is not.
Well, I would say it slightly differently in that I think it's best to think about the church as one of the ways in which Israel's calling is fulfilled, and that Israel is the religion. If we're going to use the language of religion, Israel is the people and the faith that realizes this verse. Jesus embodies that, reveals that, accomplishes it in his revelation. But I think that's already given in the giving of the law. That God.
By the way, I'm very thankful for that correction. As the husband of a Jewish wife and the friend of many Jews here in the corner, I do appreciate that correction for sure.
I think that the giving of the law is already an invitation into friendship and equality and partnership. And I mean that it begins with Abraham's friendship with God and Moses being invited into that kind of intimacy. So it may seem a minor point, and knowing you, Nate, I know it is a minor point, but for some who are hearing us, it might not be. So I thought it would be worth.
No, yeah, thank you. I definitely appreciate it.
I always love how like one of the first episodes after one of the second or third times God makes the promise to Abraham, the covenant. One of the first episodes after that is when Abraham starts like negotiating with God about Lot or about Sodom, and but that line always strikes me. Will the Lord of all the earth do injustice? And I was just teaching that to my students a few days ago, and I was like, to me, this is already a fundamental insight of the Bible. Like right here in the first 15 chapters of Genesis is God is already like the covenant a covenant is also an invitation to struggle with God straight out. And I don't think you can really do that if you really think God is just a master, right? You can't really question, you don't ask, you don't talk back. And so, that's just sort of to underscore your points.
Well, yeah. And you kind of in bringing that part out, you kind of show where there's like kind of a hidden spiritual laziness in it, right? To simply say God is God and I am not, and then throw up your hands as if there's nothing for you to do isn't what God's looking for.
Right.
He's wanting friends and coworkers in the process of transforming this earth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and it's a kind of a refusal of what we're actually called to do.
That's right. And I think if we start with Jesus as the one who fulfills the law and shows us what the law has always been about, then the opposite of obedience is servility. Like that's what he's showing us, right? That this is why, I mean, I've been working on this recently, so it's top of mind, but this is why Bonhoeffer will say about Psalm 9, Psalm 19, Psalm 119, that to obey the Lord's commands is joy, it's life. And the opposite of obedience is servility and death. So which is what you get when you have mastery and domination.
Yeah, exactly. It's also what allows for like, what is it? I think it is Psalm 89 or 19. I can't remember now, where the first half of it is like this, recounting of Israel's history, and it's praising God for calling him out. But then right in the middle of it, there's a terms like, but you have cast down your anointed one. And the rest of the whole thing is just this, like, you shattered the covenant. But it's like pretty accusatory towards God. I mean, we all know there's lots of that in the Psalms, but like, anyway, all to say that it just puts us in a certain register that I'm not sure. I don't really get that vibe from like Enuma Elish.
Right. Or to Nate's point and to Tumblr's point, or from a lot of Christian preaching and teaching. I mean,
yeah.
I'll be the first one to say I think Jews and Christians have been saying this for a very long time, and not just Jews and Christians. I mean, this is a theme that shows up, I think, anywhere anyone is really truthful about God. But man, there's a lot of not being very truthful about God going on in the world, and I don't want to downplay that either. I mean, it's not just the worship of the idol of power is not, it's not a small sect by any means.
I'm highlighting this question because I'm sure this is going to be like a common one, right? A common objection. So in the context of how we're talking right now, then what are we to make of the idea of fear of the Lord?
I think is this here's a question I have for you guys, and I was thinking about this the other day. I don't know if there's significance in it, but is there significance that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and not maybe the end?
Sure. Yeah. Lots of fathers will make that point that you can't get to the love that casts out all fear without beginning with the fear of the Lord. I think that's a kind of phenomenological account of maturation. But I do think there are other mysteries there, that it's the fear of the Lord. It's the fear the Lord has of the Lord. Isaiah's prophecy of Christ, the fear of the Lord dwells in him. So whatever we're talking about with fear, it has to be something in the way Jesus knows his Father. And we can't mean anything other than that, ultimately. And as with everything else, and this is where, for me, and I mean, Jordan and I are going to be more or less, we're going to be in the same book, if not the exact same page here. Like, I'm very Dionysian on this point. Like, all of these words are going to get reworked around the lived life of Jesus. So every word, including the word fear, including the word master, including the word slave, including the word power, including the word obedience, every word is going to get reworked around what does Jesus actually do. And we cannot bring predefined terms, fear, knowledge, the Lord, obedience, etc. We can't bring those to the discussion and wonder how Jesus fits in those definitions. Like he's the decider and the definer.
Yeah.
This is one of my very smart Jewish friends, Yosef, offered this. He says also fear, or really awe, defines the boundary, beginning edge of the space. Love defines its volume. He says it's how it's bound together.
Yeah, exactly. That's the fear of the Lord too, is like, fear isn't abstract. It's always fear of whom and in what context, right? It's there is such a thing as having a proper awe or reverence or fear for someone in a certain office or for someone you highly respect even. Mm-hmm. Like, we get nervous around certain people, not because we think they're going to threaten or inflict any suffering on us, but because actually we're almost like in awe, and so I think it couldn't just be a simple sequence. Fear of the Lord is the beginning, and then perfect love casts out fear. Is that, and I think Yosef was, but like the love is already the entire context within which fear can be better understood, right? And so, because then you know that whatever the fear is, even if you don't quite know why or what is all going on, you're never ever in doubt about the point of it.
Reverence is a good word, I think, that because like reverence kind of like gives us a way to like see a kind of a connection, but makes it so that we're not liable to confuse it with fear in the sense of horror, right?
Right.
And it's interesting because I'm the guy who quotes weird stuff. Steiner in his How to See Spiritual Worlds, he actually says that the necessary precondition to be able to sense anything in the spiritual world is reverence, which is kind of like lines up with the whole like fear of the Lord is beginning of wisdom, because the person who has no natural sense of reverence is just closed off to the spiritual world altogether.
Yeah. So like one note we might strike there is fear as especially heightened awareness of possibilities. So like when you're afraid, when you're really afraid, the ways in which kind of all of your senses come alert. Like perhaps some of what's being named here with the fear of the Lord is what would it look like to live with that kind of awareness, a heightened awareness, but that one that's not rooted in terror, right? But in in a regard, reverence for otherness that is overwhelming but never violating.
Mhm.
I like that. It's well said. Overwhelming, never violating. Yeah.
Right. Well, that never violating is yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay. So yeah, Sherry is the one who actually linked it to. You quoted you highlighted Joseph's comment,
Yep.
Luke, but Sherry actually linked it to attention, and then Joseph actually reinforced that there's a link in the meaning between seeing, attending, and fear and seeing in Hebrew. So.
Okay, I don't know if we want to take it here right away. If I get off track, just tell me to stop it. But what do you think the fear is of people to whom the idea that God would not just be primarily about power? Like, why are people afraid of that?
They are, sorry, are you saying why are people afraid of letting go of the idea that God is
Yes.
just power?
Yes.
Yeah, I see. Okay. What do you think, Luke?
I don't know, because legitimately I try to, I love to play the psychoanalysis game just as much as the next person and project onto other people why they're doing the things that they're doing and thinking the things they're thinking. But I also know that's not charitable. So if I had to guess, I would say it's their own fear. And I know this to just bring up this little hostile corner of the internet. But after our last hell discussion, I think a significant thing is people think that somehow if God isn't primarily about power and a certain kind of penal justice and almost like vengeance, then I don't know, like people get away with things, my hurt won't be my hurt. The hurt of those that I love will not be okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also wonder if it's like my most charitable read of this that I can muster is that people think if everything is a sort of guaranteed happy ending, then what's the fuss with all the tragedy and evil and terrible things that we experience around us now? And so it's like God must have an absolutely great reason not to intervene in a myriad of tragedies and traumas right now in this moment. And so if we've sort of conceded that in his power, it doesn't use it in that way to prevent these things now, then sort of who's to say that couldn't, in a sense, be eternally the case, That's like my nice read of it. That doesn't have to do with maybe like a psychoanalytic, what's your projections, here, but kind of like as a way of saying, there's got to be something that almost acts as a, if not an explicit justification, at least a reason for toleration of all the tragedies and hells here on earth in this existence. And if you're just saying kind of in the end, you can wipe away the big one, the eternal conscious torment sort of thing, then, it sort of makes a mockery. And the one thing people really want to hang on to in the midst of tragedy and in the problem of evil is that what they do matters.
Mm-hmm.
And so they think having just a guaranteed happy ending, I don't agree with this, but I think a lot of people think if you just say, well, it's all going to be nice in the end, like Candyland or something where everyone wins, then what's the point of the game? But that would mean nothing matters that I actually do. I think there's a whole lot of problems with that, but I can at least get that at like a visceral level. I think it rests on a lot of mischaracterizations of several things, but I at least get it.
Well, but here's the thing, though. Like, it's like, so if it's in the kind of like, if it's in the kind of frame, it depends on the. I think it depends. There's some nuance here because it depends on the theological framework. Let's say you're a Calvinist, right? And you actually are like, you kind of are very much within the stereotype of what Tom Bird sets up. How do your actions matter anyway? If it's all in control, if every single thing is actually fully in the control of God Almighty, and nothing can ever happen that is not the direct result of the will or consent of God Almighty, then how do your actions have meaning?
Right.
Which you still have, so you don't save any sensitive action for your meaning. I actually think that Chris, in his sermon that kind of inspired this live stream, I think he actually comes very near to the point, if not directly on. There's a part toward the end of the sermon where he links the lust for power and the desire to be a master to fear of death, and I think that is probably closer to the truth in a lot of cases.
Yeah. I think two notes to add here. One would be, I think some of this is not. It's an inadequacy in the way our thinking has been structured. We're imagining God and God's power is what makes thinking possible, makes all thinking possible. So if you take that away, for some people, you don't have categories anymore for thinking. I'll have to make the second point in just a second. My dog needs help. Hopefully I won't forget it since I'm on.
I want to know what the dog's saying.
This is
saying right on.
I think also, Chris, connected to that, I mean, this isn't what Nate was talking about, and don't forget your other point, but what you said, you talking about self-control in that sermon is one of the best things I've heard on self-control in general. Because self-control is kind of on its face, it's like it's an oxymoron. Like it doesn't.
That is exactly my point, Luke.
Okay.
Like, we've defined our terms, like control and self-control and all that. We've defined the terms in such a way that actually God is boxed in as the guarantor of the parameters of the game we're playing. Right? So God is just the name for the structure of things. And as long as that's true, we're not just dealing with an idolatry of power, but with an absolutization of power, an idolatrous concept of it. But it's been so set that we think by it, right? We're not thinking of it, we're thinking by it. And because we're thinking by it, we can't recognize it. That's the point I was wanting to make. All right, I'll be right back.
No, you should really live that way he just said. I don't know if you realize how much that vindicates like so much of what you're saying all the time.
I mean, go ahead and explain
propositions and the use of propositional language and the need to systematize. There's a lot of what Chris says. It tells you why we are misled by those things.
Well, that is
that's really the closed world, right? That's the circle of the closed world.
Yeah, it's the Ouroboros, and it's the system that sacrifices everything that's outside or other or chaotic or unknown, but then sometimes the paradoxical upside down thing that happens outside the walls of the camp is the savior, the saving of the world.
Yeah.
It's the, I don't know. I mean, even with my universalism, something that I don't want to close off, that's a big pushback to this, I think is tied into this. I'm not just trying to bring up universalism all the time. I'm sorry. But
okay.
No, I mean, it's definitely in the background here. I'm intentionally coming at it at a slant here.
I know.
It definitely is a related issue.
I'll always make it not slant like the unwise person that I am. But there is something about not absolutizing my understanding of a system of universalism where God just makes everything right. I don't know how it's going to look, like how I have no idea. And like, I've made videos before on like the severity of Christian universalism. Like I said this recently to Christian Baxter in a conversation, and I think it's true. Like it's almost the idea of the Christian bodhisattva or something. Like if the goal really is to love your enemy, to love the neighbor, to love everyone up to the point of the death, well then if someone's in hell, I'm there too. Like I mean, how can, it's that idea of just like, I don't know, is it a Jonathan Edwards idea of just like of people just like gleefully sitting in heaven as people are tortured in hell for their sins? Like,
That's an old idea.
It's a really old idea. Aquinas said that too.
I mean, it's so, I don't get it. I don't get it. How you can, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, or forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Like if that just isn't leaving the 99 for the one. Like how can I be in heaven if someone's in hell?
I also have to say too, like if I don't know, I'll just so if well, I'll go a different route. I wonder about this, Chris. I wonder what you would say about this in particular. This fear of losing a god of power being tied up with the fear of death is really interesting. I like that. I also wonder sometimes if I wonder if there's a link between something like I'd want to call a fear of life,
Mm-hmm.
which is paradoxically the same kind of fear.
Yeah.
Because and here I'm really getting like very seemingly not related, but I'm thinking of like Paul de Man's critique of Kant, and the particular image he likes to use about Kant's formalism, the pure formalism of the analytic system, is he calls it a falling body, which is to say like a corpse that's just falling in a vacuum. And it's no particular corpse at all, though. That's the paradox of it, is that you don't think you're staring at a corpse, a body of formal syllogisms or whatever, formal principles, conceptualities, and antinomies. You don't think you're staring at a corpse. You think you're mapping out life and the limits of reason and everything else. But what you're really doing is not just sapping life out of everything, but you're almost making everything less than a life to sap anything out of at all. Like
it's like the spirit of dissection, Jordan.
Exactly, and it's there's no particular body that you're killing. That's why it doesn't feel like a killing. It doesn't feel like an act. All it feels like is you're just sort of like neutrally third person observer mapping out taxonomically everything. But what you're really doing, like you can spin that as like it's an act of grasping and trying to control and master everything, which I think, yes, there's that. But almost at the same time, it's such a successful self-deceptive mastery that you don't feel like you're doing that at all. You don't feel like it's violent at all. And so, and what you're really doing, though, is resisting the fact that life is always already more than any thought you can have about it. And you're basically denying in principle that is ever the case in any particular case. And so that almost looks to me like a fear of life.
You're trying to take something which is constantly in motion and render it static. I don't know why I want to say it that way, but that's really kind of what that's like. If I were to try to use a metaphor to describe what's going on, and when we're doing that kind of thinking, we're something that is inherently in motion and vibrant and moving and changing. We try to just create a perfect snapshot or still life of it, but we lose it in the process of doing that.
And this does relate, by the way. I'll just make this last remark and then I'll kind of stop, because I remember I called. I was wondering what Chris thought about it, and I forgot it. I got caught up in my own talking, which I probably do a lot to my students, so I apologize. I'm in that mode, but this is what I think happens a lot with say like freedom versus a determinism or a necessity. And universalism can't be something you can know ahead of time, because somehow that inherently negates freedom. How could you know and master what will happen in freedom? But the thing is, the one who has just analyzed all cases and said they either are free or they are determined has themselves just evacuated the life out of any particular life. The logic of freedom is that it has a history, which means that its logic can't be confined to any moment or two of its own history. It's the whole. It's the whole unfolding. And that and all I think a universalist has to say is that God knows how to work with, in, and towards the perfection of that history. But that's not even allowed with the analytic categories anyway. That would be like one way I would apply that point. But Chris, what do you think? Fear of life, fear of death?
Yeah, I think they're indistinguishable, because I think Jesus shows that there is a way of dying that belongs to living. And so, yes, I think you've put your finger on it. In fact, I think you could probably gloss Hebrews that way, right? That Jesus has destroyed the one who all of our lives has used our fear of life to enslave us, our fear of living the kind of life that ends in death, right? What we're really wanting is a kind of life, Hauerwas puts it so cheekily, right? We're trying to live a life that gets us out of life alive, and shows that that's not the life we're meant to live, right? That actually we're meant to live a life that ends in death, but this kind of death. But I do think it's worth, I think, like trying to get a little more inside the minds and hearts of those who would resist what we're saying, and not just about universalism, but specifically about power. And I know that really they're connected, but I don't know that for everyone who's thinking them, the connection is obvious.
Right.
And at least
I know that, Chris, because my mother, who doesn't have a universalist bone in her body, loved your sermon.
Right.
She was able to receive that, but she will not truck with universalism whatsoever. So yeah, that's definitely the case.
And I think for us sitting around this conversation, we probably, the way we've thought it through, those things, one entails the other. But I think for a lot of people, they don't. Whether they've thought it through clearly or not, they just, one thing doesn't lead to the other necessarily. And so I'm going to start by just a couple of comments about why I think people might be like sticking with that notion of God's power as being dominant, as God being a master in some way, and us needing that. I think the dark side of that is evil wants us to believe that. And I mean, I'm convinced that evil is at work in the world, right? That there is a way in which evil is tricky. I mean, I think we've discussed, Nate, the difference between the demonic and the satanic. And I think that the evil is always working on us in both of those ways at once, right? Threatening us with destruction and undoing, the demonic, and then offering us a solution to that, the satanic, right? A false light, a way forward. And this idolatrous conception of power is, I would argue, a satanic solution to the threat of the demonic.
Yeah, it reminds me of Merton's The Moral Theology of the Devil.
Yeah. I think that's exactly.
That's a good thing. I want to just repeat it: a satanic solution to the threats and the problems of the demonic. Yeah,
I think that's what's going on, but I don't think that's what people are experiencing or thinking. Right?
No. Yeah, totally.
Happening. I think what, by and large, I think. Now, of course, I'm bracketing out, the people who are just a little worried that we're being faddish, and so they're standing off with devil's advocate. I mean, we need those people too, but I'm not addressing. I'm addressing like people who genuinely want to say what we're saying or something like it and can't see a way to do it. Does that make sense? Like that particular group of people who are like, I want to go there, but I just don't know how to go there.
I need more people like that in my life.
I'm blessed.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Maybe I'll send some.
Okay, good.
Actually, they email Grail Country all the time. Look, I'm surprised that you don't hear from them.
It's probably a salience problem. I just focus on the people that get mad at me.
I think it's this effect. And I mean, this will get me upset. If I weren't so drugged, I would be red faced now. But for those who don't know, like, the pain of this.
He had to prove it.
Thank you for being a trooper and joining us to do this evening.
Oh,
Chris.
I
It's
was-
appreciated.
I mean, I will never listen to it again because there's no telling what I'm going to say. But
Perfect.
I was just about to say it's actually especially good that you're
Yeah.
bringing up right now.
But I really do think I feel a lot of compassion for people who are stuck there.
Yeah.
Who desperately want to believe that God is this good and this capable, but just don't know how to get their hearts and minds to that place. And I get really angry at the people who have talked about God in such a way that I think they've damaged a lot of people's capacity to believe that. It feels like a risk. It feels like I don't know that I can take the chance of saying the things you're saying, because what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong, not just for my own sake, but for the sake of other people that I love? I mean, and for a lot of people, there are some, I think, Jonathan Edwards, you mentioned, who might be a little too eager to think about the sufferings of the damned. But I think most people, that anguishes them. But they genuinely, at some level, they genuinely fear if their theology is not right, that's going to be exploited to the harm of other people. And so they got to keep theology right. And what they think that means is there's things I just can't think about God. There are speculations I can't risk about God. And I think it's a deep disease that shows we lack the kind of boldness in prayer and the kind of boldness in speculative dialogue that actually will grow wherever we're healthy. Like, I think there's something really servile. I think our spirits are broken, if I could put it like that. I think that a lot of us have been given a Christianity that broke our spirits, so we would never dare talk to God or about God in any daring way. That feels too risky. It's a little bit like being in the house with an alcoholic. Like, you just don't know what you're going to do that's going to set that off. And I have a lot of compassion for that particular group of people. And I understand why what we're doing here raises their blood pressure, because it feels like, guys, you're going to stir something up. Can we deal with the fallout? Does that make any sense at all? Or is that
No, it does. And what came to my mind, though, is like, so my personal switch to universalism was kind of a switch from the analytical, logical mode, from the because I became an annihilationist because of as Protestant, sola scriptura, exegesis seemed like the smartest case. And then at some point, I kind of made the switch to what's the most beautiful story? Well, it's that everyone is redeemed and reconciled and forgives each other, and the facts of history aren't changed, but the meaning is changed for everyone, and your enemy becomes as the Avett brothers so wonderfully said, I have no enemies. And that's just the best story. Nobody gets away with anything. Everybody forgives and loves each other. That's the best story. And I'm just like, and in the sense of what we were saying earlier with Abraham and Job and David and all these great figures that Jacob wrestled with God, I think God, be bold and mighty forces will come to your aid. I think God wants us to hope in the best story and think he's that great to accomplish it. I just don't even, I don't know, is the reason that would be scary to you just merely because of this kind of pastoral, institutional, theological child abuse?
I don't think that's the only thing. I think that's a factor for a group of people. I certainly don't think by any means, but
I also think, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, I think that unfortunately there are ways of construing the aesthetics so that there is another story, a story of loss. And I think this is the story that C.S. Lewis is telling. Depending on how you read it, that seems to be what he's saying the great divorce is. Like that the end of all things is a great separation, a great dividing. And that is the story that's told. But then, of course,
it's the tragic defeat of God by human free will. That's the story that Lewis
is drawn to that story. That's what he sees in Norse mythology. That's what he's moved by that. So I think we got to be careful with what's the most moving story, because I don't know that we can get to an agreement on that. Or, I mean, I'm interested in it. I just don't know that that's it's not going to settle the question for everybody. And also, I think there's a kind of ethos at play in a lot of circles. You see this, for instance, in like Peter Leithart's review of David Bentley Hart's That All Shall Be Saved. But there's like when you're dealing with someone like Leithart, I mean, eminently capable, right? There's not like any kind of lack of training or any kind of lack of facility. You know, it's obvious, like he has all he would need to see what it is that's being argued. He's just unpersuaded by the framework. And I think that's a different category too. I'm not suggesting that Leithart only thinks that because, you know, his pastor reviewed, you know, like that's not what I mean. I think there are genuine disagreements there that run all the way down, that just kind of run all the way to the bottom. And we're not going to get past all of those, right? I'm just speaking to those people who would want to say what we're saying and are afraid to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I don't think I can say anything to the Leithart camp that's going to change their mind because the framework's too different. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm willing to dialogue. It's not like, it's not a refusal to talk. It's just to say, I don't think there's much that can happen there. But I do think there are a lot of people who are like, you know, fear and trembling. I would like to believe it, but I just can't quite make the connection.
Yeah. And I think Sherry was just saying this in the comments, and this is exactly what I was about to say. Which is that I think some of those people in that camp that you're talking about, Chris, and I've met some of these in my own students, and we all probably know some of them among our friends and family, and maybe ourselves have struggled with it, is we start to believe that evil really is essentially what I am.
Right.
A worm really is what I am. I am a piece of trash. I don't deserve anything, and it's not deserve even. It's I don't. You know what is man that you're mindful of him? It's that sort of like. It's that though even can sound sort of like, oh, it's just a distinction in the hierarchy of being. I'm so low, but it's not even that. It's like I'm wicked. You know, I'm ignorant. I am a betrayer. I am all the things that are bad. and so how could I like draw God's loving gaze? Why would God, what does God see whenever God looks at me that's worth anything? But right there is where I have found that I have to like turn the conversation, especially if I'm talking to somebody like one-on-one or something, where I go, look, I know that even here though, there's a risk of like a deception. Because I know you think that you are loathing yourself, but you are loathing a child of God. And as one who has children, I can tell you how that would make me feel if my child does that. I have already had to address that with two of my kids that are saying things about themselves that I don't know where they're getting that. You know, and they might even be able to point to some, you know, objective cases or actions or events that where it's like, look, see, I'm this way. And it's like, no, you did that thing, but you're not that. And so one thing I want to point to is that God has so bound himself to, I mean, I think of this George MacDonald line where he says, had God never created us at all, I don't know whether he would be obliged to us. I have more opinions on that maybe than he does, but then he says, but since he did, I say he has all the more. Right. And then if you add the incarnation into all of that, it simply just intensifies where you say, look, it actually ceases to be a sign of self-deprecation or humility or pious self-loathing when you deny the extremity of God's solidarity with his own children and creatures, which he like who are you to resist that? And if that is true, then what is true of you reflects back on the Maker and on the Father and on the Son, who is our brother.
Yeah, that's right.
And for whom he died for you as well. And Maximus says this: he died for me on the cross. That's not just an evangelical song. Maximus is saying that, right? It's like, it was me.
Yeah.
I put him on the cross, but he also dies for me, right? So it's like, there's that. The deception can be this. The deception is that I can so sever myself from God and isolate myself as my own target, that somehow that's not an offense against God all the greater.
Yeah.
But it is.
That's right. And I mean, this is what you're going to see in an argument like Athanasius saying it was not fitting for God to let us fall into non-being. Like God can't let that happen because we are God's workmanship, right? Drawing on that line from Paul. Or, I mean, maybe my favorite example of this, Gregory's sermons on Ecclesiastes, where he's talking about what Solomon has done in getting him slaves and slave girls. And he says, like, who are you to own another human being? To God alone belongs that power. No, not even to God himself.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah.
And like, that's the line. Like, that's the line. That owning slaves belongs to God alone. No, not even to God alone.
Who said that, Chris? St. Gregory?
Nyssa, yeah. Gregory of Nyssa, sermon on Ecclesiastes, sermons on Ecclesiastes.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like that. Like that's the insight, right? Because I think for a lot of us, our whole kind of moral framework is built on God has a right to do whatever he wants because he's God. He made us. Because he made us, he can do with us what he wants, right? And there's a way of reading that right off the surface of Romans 9 or whatever other text you want to pick. And what Gregory is doing is saying, no, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what creation is, because it's not rooted in what incarnation is, right? And and now we're right back to what we see Maximus recognizing in Dionysius or in Gregory, in Athanasius. I mean, but for a lot of the folks who are in conversation with me, they don't know any of that. They've been given a Christianity that assumes God has the most of everything. God's life is the most privileged of all lives. He's at the top of the top. He's got the most knowledge. He's got the most power. He's got the most resources. He has the most rights because he's the one who owns everything. And like, we just have to come to recognize that entire framework is alien to the Christian tradition. I mean, that framework is alien to all forms of Christian tradition, right? Like that is a very peculiar, very American imposition. Right?
I was going to say, not America, Chris.
But I mean, again, I think there are a lot of people we're talking with who are stuck in that. They really do think God's life is right, that the incarnation only makes a kind of emotive sense if he's giving up his privilege to come and live with us. Yeah. Right? So the incarnation is a humiliation. God abandons his privilege for a while to live.
God just did it that one time. Just made himself low.
Yeah. And I mean,
I don't think I think in your original sermon, you don't mention Girard once, but there's a lot of Girardian assumptions kind of in the background of what you say there. And I particularly like your emphasis on that the sacrifice comes from God, and God isn't asking us to make sacrifice. I started to say something about that earlier because Luke talked about sacrifice, and it seems to be like there's a lot of demand for sacrifice right now, just out there in the ether, and sacrifice is being talked about as a unambiguously good and Christian thing.
Well, don't you?
But I don't think. But the understanding of sacrifice is based on what you were just talking about.
That's right. And now we're to what I was saying. You know, the second point that I didn't make when I walked out of the room to try to take care of Augie, Carl Augustine Wyman, by the way, that it's a kind of inverse, Nate, of Bulgakov's Holy Grail idea. Right. I think there is kind of shadow saturation of idolatry on all things. That we instinctively trust the power of sacrifice. And the reason we instinctively trust it is that we think there are power dynamics at work. And there are. Here's the thing.
There are, yeah.
At work.
Well,
Sacrifices do work in a certain way within certain parameters for a certain amount of time. They can create certain kinds of outcomes. And I think the darker reason,
and they do create and sustain a world, but the problem is that the world that it sustains and creates is the world in the bad sense, and not the world in the good sense.
it's a false incarnation, right? That Jordan talked about. But so I like the deepest answer I would give to this question is, I think instinctively, like in our bones, we are conditioned to trust sacrifice, and in that sense, we think there is power at play that can be manipulated. And the reason we need God to be powerful in that sense is that if he's not, we have nothing to leverage. This is how I think sacrifice begins. This is why Cain comes to God with a sacrifice. He's trying to leverage something. He wants back into Eden, whatever it is. He wants an outcome. Sacrifice is an attempt to leverage it. And this is why he's incensed when his sacrifice is not met. Right. And I think the reason that Hebrew scriptures are constantly reminding us God does not want sacrifice. God does not want sacrifice. Obedience is better than sacrifice. If I was hungry, I wouldn't ask you. I hate your sacrifices, etc., etc., etc. Is precisely because it knows we want to use it. In fact, I think Aquinas' argument about the sacrificial system is that God gives it to us to show us that it won't work. Mm-hmm. It's demystifying, a kind of demythologizing of sacrifice by making us do it until we realize that doesn't work. That's not what God wants. But I think that's in us. And I think that whatever we're talking about, we talk about the power of evil, the mystery of iniquity. This is what we're talking about, right? So with all those other caveats about, the best intentions and people just lacking the vocabulary, I think there's a really dark force at play here too.
Well, yeah, and just to play into that, so this is our village atheist who not surprising at all to me,
our village
wants to make sure that we keep that image of God as an idol of power as much in mind as possible, and quotes and cherry pick scriptures that emphasize that image of God. So there we have it.
I'll just go with Origen, who already in 220 pointed out that wrath is a fruit of the flesh in Galatians, rather than a fruit of the Spirit. And so, as he says, then whatever it means to predicate wrath of God, it cannot mean what it means to be a work of the flesh, since God is Spirit, John 4. This is just kind of the way they always used to read it, but then in our pretty myopic, fairly recent American truncated anti-Christian faith, which happens to be the mere inversion of the atheistic version of it, everything is so easy.
I'm going to drop a link to give Joseph a chance to come on here, because Joseph is really smart, and I'm sure he has something meaningful to say. So I
should just message him.
I'm going to drop the link and have him come on, and I would like to let him push back on
while Joseph gets here
on whether we were talking about sacrifice.
While Joseph gets here, can I ask this question? Because it's a question I have, and it's a little bit of steel manning of people who don't agree with us. But
oh, there we go. He wants it. So
okay. So
yeah.
So do not take vengeance. Vengeance is the Lord's. I will repay. What does that mean? Can you have because I think most people's understanding of that would be satanic in the way that we were talking about it earlier. Transactional. I don't have to take vengeance because God will for me.
It's just saving up for the day when it's finally going to come. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what I think it means is when Paul says I was crucified with Christ, the crucifixion is a place that was receiving the wrath of God. I mean, but does that mean God came out like a crusader and started slaying him? No, it's his death, his slaying is his true birth, his true life.
Welcome, Joseph.
And so
Hey,
actually,
okay.
if we try to take vengeance, then we're inevitably going to do it the way that God wouldn't. So
I just have a couple of minutes because it's bedtime around here. But
Yeah, sure, but I would love to hear your critique.
so to me, this is it's a very different framing of sacrifice, I guess, than we have in Judaism, because we don't even, I mean, and you and I we've talked about this before. Because for us, like, right, so there is no true ownership. The animals are all God's. You're giving back God what is his in the first place, which is kind of just acknowledging it's not yours. The word the word has a totally different connotation in Hebrew. The word is korban, which I know appears in the New Testament, but in a very weird context. In Hebrew, korban comes from the word to draw closer, l'karev. And it's always about a relationality, and whatever this thing is that you're doing, the sacrifice, is bringing you closer to God. But there's also like so many other, to unpack all the different things. I mean, like Chris was saying, or just a little bit, 'cause I just have a couple minutes, but like, I don't want to take too much of your stream time.
Do it.
So something that comes up a lot is, yes, the Tanakh, right, the Hebrew Bible, many times, there's this, I mean, you're not wrong, right? It does say, like, you think I want your sacrifices, but almost every single time it says that, it qualifies it. It says, oh, I would like your sacrifices if they were in the right spirit, but you're not doing them in the right spirit. You don't understand what sacrifice is. It's not a rejection of the animal sacrifice system, just wholesale. It's not saying that this is totally a waste of time. I was trying to trick you, like, this isn't it. I'm going to take a really, like, different line than Augustine, obviously. But right, it's saying, like, if you guys, were doing all, like, what you're righteous and pious and not oppressing the poor and, like, doing all the things that are good in the first place, then the sacrificial system would work in a sense. But because this is something I often have to point out, there's a lot of different sacrifices, right? And they're not all the same. They all have different nuances. But the thing that we call the sin offering is never for intentional sin. You can't give a sin offering for intentional sin. It's always for sins, not because, it's not for sins that you did on purpose. Those only can be, you have to actually go through repentance, like, for those things, right? Proper atonement, repentance, like the forgiveness process, regret, confession, all those things that have to happen. The sacrifice does not happen there. It only happens if for negligence. So things that you did that you weren't attending to properly. And if you look specifically at the sin offering, the entire system, and it's one of the most demanding types of offerings you have to bring. And that's because the contention is it requires you to learn how to reorient your attention so you aren't as negligent in the future. Right? So it's really a psychological process of going through. It has the most stringent purification processes, the most stringent rules about the type of how you treat the animal, the type of animal. Someone else can't bring a sin offering for you. Like, only you can do it, because how can anyone else repair your psychology, right? Like, if it's a negligence thing and it's your attention, then of course someone can bring a sin offering on your behalf. And this is this is an entirely different concept than, I'm not going to even deal with, like, Christology and how Jesus fits into this, because, like, it's a wholly different discussion, right? The sin offering.
That's why penal substitutionary atonement sucks.
It just doesn't make sense from the sin offering perspective.
Right,
I mean, there's other offerings we can talk about, the Paschal offering and Yom Kippur and guilt offerings, right? There's other things here. But really, it's really, really rare to find any sort of time when you have to bring an offering for something you did on purpose. Almost all the offerings are out of thanks, peace offerings, fully burnt offerings. Oh, hi. Are you going? Okay. Okay, I probably have to deal with bedtime. But like, I'm just saying, like, this is just such a different frame for me that I find it odd in some ways, because there are power dynamics here, I'd agree, but the power dynamics are so different. The whole framing is so different.
One thing really quick, you seem to be, let me make sure I'm following you, Yosef. You seem to be kind of agreeing with Pajot's linking between sacrifice and attention. Is that, am I following you correctly in that? Or did I misunderstand?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're following me correctly.
Okay.
Or there's not these kind of unhealthy power dynamics as much in Judaism and their understanding of sacrifice as you see it.
I mean, I think there can be. There's warnings about it. I think what Chris is pointing out is warnings about misuse of it are there, but I don't think they're not institutionalized in the same way, perhaps,
Right.
because we maintain a lot of the nuance of all the different types of sacrifices, and there are different spaces for each type. I think that it doesn't get conflated necessarily.
Can I ask one question before you got to run? I know
Yeah,
you got to run.
last question.
We can do this some other time. But
I think,
wouldn't it be fair to say that there are lines of thought within Judaism? I'm thinking specifically of those that are going to influence Christianity most directly. Philo, the Alexandrian line, and then much later, figures like Rosenzweig, Buber, Levinas. Like, you're going to get both before you get anything like Christianity and long after it, you are going to get Jewish theologians who are making an argument very similar to the one that I'm making. I agree it's not like universally the case, but it's not only a Christian argument.
you don't find it in, I would tell you what, don't really find it in rabbinic Judaism, right? So like you find it in the other, right, in Hellenistic kind of Alexandrian Philo makes something like that. It's a little bit different. Uber and Levinas are coming at it already from like a very, modernity, post-enlightenment, and they're also very influenced by Maimonides, who thinks that that animal sacrifice will not happen in the third temple. And
That's
not that sacrifice won't happen, but animal sacrifice won't happen. He thinks it's just going to be, there's different understandings, but it might be vegetarian, whatever, there's something. But
and I do just want to make one point clear from my side of it.
okay.
I think the New Testament Christian argument very much is there is a sacrifice that needs to be offered. So I don't think it's totally against sacrifice. Think of the language of Hebrews. This is the sacrifice that God has required. So it's very much, I think there's way more in common than there are differences here. And of course, there are going to be real differences. But there's a lot more than not.
Yeah, I'd agree. We'll definitely talk later.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Yeah, we'll have to have a conversation sometime, Joseph.
Thanks, Joseph.
All right.
So essentially, sacrifice as mammon, as transaction, is not what we're talking about, because you cannot serve God and mammon.
That's what I was hearing in that.
Yeah.
That would be the commonality, right? Because the way you guys were talking about sacrifice, when it's turned to transactional, then it has nothing to. It's like an external impersonal force.
Yeah.
You are a reservoir of a greater force. Since we're finite and limited, we need access to that. What do I need to get access to that so that I can have X, Y, or Z or whatever, So, yeah, I don't know how divergent that is.
Part of what's at stake for me, and this is why, Nate, I'm glad you brought Joseph into the conversation, is that I want to make, because I actually think this is what the New Testament is making, a non-supersessionist account of Israel's turn from sacrifice in Jesus. So like I think that we need to be very careful here not to set up Christianity as that which liberates us from what in Judaism was the power.
Well, yeah, right. And one of the things that one of the things that Joseph said that resonated with me is he talked about like linking the word for sacrifice to the idea of turning toward. But I think what the Christian idea of sacrifice is bringing to the equation is that it's not only us turning toward God, but God turns toward us. And so it's not really like, it doesn't overturn that understanding of proper sacrifice being a turning toward. It just takes it into a higher degree of mutuality, where God is also turning to meet us as we approach the altar.
Yes, and if we shift just for the sake of conversation in English to talking about gift, I think there is a way of seeing sacrifice. So think about, I have very strong disagreements with a lot of what she does, but Sonderegger in her systematics tries to make an argument that there are only there's only one procession in God, and that it is the movement of sacrifice, not two processions, but only one, and it's the movement of sacrifice. And I think she's wrong, terribly wrong about that. But she does make this point about how when we see an old man loving his wife who's demented, and we see him living devotedly, caring for her. We recognize that that's sacrifice, and we also recognize that it's good.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I think she's put her finger on something there that we have to own, right? Like that, whatever that is, it is sacrificial and it is good. In fact,
But it's because she loves, right? This is what Stephen's been saying in the thing. It's this weird thing where like love requires sacrifice, but the love is so much more where you don't care.
Well, it's because in order for us to feel that way about it, we have to feel like we see the intention behind it, right? Because it actually, that entire same action, if it's being done for the wrong motivations, it taints it entirely. So we have to actually see, spiritually, we have to discern that, oh, he's doing this out of his love for this person. That's what makes it both a sacrifice and beautiful at the same time.
Yes. But there's something about that sacrifice that can't carry over into the age to come. And this I think is also essential. That gift can, but sacrifice does not. So that's another, I think, boundary we have to cross. And I do think, Bonhoeffer's a really helpful dialogue partner here too, in that we don't want to do away with power altogether, the kind of power that is at play amongst us. We want to be responsible for that power. We just don't want to think that God has that power stockpiled, or that that's the kind of power God uses.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like God's power is, and this is where I'm back to Dionysius, like we don't know what that word means when we're talking about God. And it doesn't have any more or any less to do with what you and I mean by power or weakness than it has to do with any other word down the list of descriptors. Mm-hmm. So I think that's another confusion we have here. Like I'm not really drawn toward open theist accounts of powerlessness or process theology accounts of powerlessness, or the stuff out of Derrida, John Caputo, and weak theology. Like none of that. Like to me, that's part of the problem. Like I don't think that way is the way toward clarity at all, and that's not at all what I'm arguing for, right? Mm-hmm. But it might sound similar when I'm saying, when I say something like God is not in control,
right?
But it's not to say that God's not sovereign. It's to say that to be sovereign, it's back to the passage you read, right?
Mm-hmm.
The intrinsic authority of truth, goodness, and beauty.
Exactly.
Like God doesn't need some other agency to employ. He doesn't use power. God is just God. He doesn't have a resource of power that he sometimes draws on to exert force or not, right? Insofar as he does, that's what we call angels.
Right.
But that's not intrinsic to his being, right? And so some of this is just category confusion on top of category confusion on top of category confusion. There is a place for power between us that needs
let's talk about that, because that's something where we might have some slight disagreements, with me being a Christian anarchist and a pacifist. Let's talk about, like, so what do you see as the proper use of, let's call that horizontal power, right? I think that's because you're talking about power that happens on essentially on the same gradation of being, right? On the human level, human to human. Okay, so what is it that you think justifies the use of power in that sense?
Well, we're almost certainly going to run right into all kinds of semantic traps here, but just as
sure.
What I'm talking about is, I think in order to love one another well, given all the disparities that we have in life because of how it has to be lived, I'm a parent to my children, and for much of their life, because of the way time works, my responsibilities to them require an imbalance of power, in that I have far greater responsibilities to them than they do to me. Mm-hmm. And I therefore have to have the graces necessary to fulfill those responsibilities. Right? That's, I mean power by that. Or a teacher to my students. right? Of course, there are all kinds of ways in which I learn more from my students than they do from me, but there has to be a certain way, authority and power both at play, in order for me to instruct them well, right? And so I think in all of those, Ivan Illich will talk about this, the power of the host, and he's as close to an anarchist as you can get, I think. But even he will say, in order to have friendship, there must be someone who will take the lead and host. Right? So that even that, in that minimal way, they're still come across my threshold to my table. Here's my cup and my loaf of bread for you. Like, I'm having to make the decision to invite you in, to open the door, to give you a seat at the table. And so I think it needs to be lived with humility and patience and playfulness. So like, this is in no way a kind of Milbankian account of power here. Like, I'm not arguing for that, but I do think that there are power differentials in every relationship, some more pronounced than others, and that they can be lived responsibly, and that the measure of that being lived responsibly is whether or not the person with it has the character of Jesus. Can they live sacrificially, open-handedly, playfully? But yeah, so I'm not quite an anarchist in that way.
Right. Yeah, I knew you weren't, and that's why I kind of just wanted to see like so. That's interesting. I think, yeah, I'll have to think about that.
Well, so my response, because I identify as an anarchist, so I'll jump in and play. It's almost as if and this could be semantic. This could be just a semantic issue. I see power as fundamentally deriven from earthly hierarchy in the Bible or the satanic. It's transactional. Power is transactional to me, whereas authority is something that is synergistic and happens among any properly oriented body. Like, my head is not exerting power over my hand. It has rightful authority, and they're working in submission and obedience.
So
just automatically.
The letter I read from at the beginning from Tomberg is the letter on the emperor, right? And what the subject of that letter is actually the difference between power and authority. And he talks about, that's the reason why he says that the symbol of authority is the scepter, right? So the emperor holds a scepter and not a sword, because natural authority is non-coercive, and power is coercive. Like, so essentially, like, that's what distinguishes power from authority in that letter. And so, although I say I'm an anarchist, that doesn't mean that I recognize no authority. I do recognize authority. I think authority is just part of the created order, right?
Well, just wisdom. Like, I have authority over my son.
And that God is the ultimate source of authority.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily think that claims to power on the horizontal are legitimate.
But that can be what Chris, you'd agree with all that, wouldn't you, Chris? I imagine.
I think so. Some of it gets a little tricky.
Again, it's the semantic trap that Chris was talking about.
Yeah.
So I acknowledge that. It's just kind of a little bit of it is just strictly a semantic argument.
I do worry. Just in terms of where I'm coming from, because I doubt we disagree much, if at all. But in terms of where I'm coming from, I do think our aversion to violence can sometimes cause us to do away with all force. And I do think God's love can be forceful, but is never violent.
Yes.
And I think that we actually need, and I'm just so deeply influenced here by the Christian tradition that emphasizes obedience as essential to understanding. That the mind does not obey cannot learn, and
so
you can't learn the word.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. So the conversation I just had with Jordan Hall was on the Arcanum of Force, which is the 11th letter of Meditations on the Tarot, and the symbol of force is the virgin. It's the virgin, and the image of force in the tarot is a young virgin woman who is opening the jaws of a lion. But Tomberg says clearly that this is not happening in accordance with with power in the quantitative, right? That that the virgin is operating from within the realm of quality, and that the force that she exerts is non-coercive, and what she does is she brings out the natural animality of the lion instead of its bestiality. So the lion actually obeys its own better nature in its obeying the compelling force that the virgin represents. And this is precisely the way God operates on us. Like you said in your sermon, it's like it's not God who coerces and possesses. That's what the demons do.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I love that image. And
God increases our agency and makes us more us.
Yes.
So, and that's what force does. Real force.
That image of the virgin prying open the mouth of the lion, like that to me captures all the dynamics we want. I mean, so one of the things to bring this back to Maximus again, like the juxtaposition of opposites, like when we're talking about the power of God at work, we're talking about bringing, like you can't talk about it without talking about that juxtaposition, right? So, like Jordan, jump in on that point, because I think this is where a lot of our talk about these things goes wrong, because it's working from polarities instead of the juxtaposition of the opposites.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that came to mind a while ago was just to underscore some potential semantic trap is that, it's like the famous sort of, or infamous kind of difficulty of whenever you want to translate the Greek word dynamis, where dynamism come from. What do? Do you say power? Do you say potency? And people have like very strong opinions about that. And you might think that's some people in the audience might think that's random. It's not. It's just such an important word for like Aristotle. It's an important word for all these major thinkers. And so you have to contend with it. And one of the things about power that's kind of a bad translation is that there really is no such thing as a dynamis, or a power that isn't already formed by its act. I mean, you can put this really in nerdy Aristotelian way and say, we only perceive the potency of something through its actualization. Mm-hmm. So you first see the thing in actuality, then you think back to its potency. But the kind of very important speculative, or if you like, conceptual point there is that it's too easy to sort of think about a latent power that's then later actualized. The really remarkable thing is to realize that there would never have been a power latent at all had it not always already been anticipating its own actualization.
Right.
Which means that power, one of the seductive aspects of power is that it's almost always ill-defined. Right? It's power for what? Power to do what? Power to accomplish what?
Yes.
And so that also gets back to something you said earlier, Nate, about the intentionality. And so one of the things I would want to say is that the reason why Paul can say in Corinthians that Christ crucified has become for us the power and wisdom of God. If you want to be Aristotelian about it, he's looking first at the enacted power of God. And then he's thinking back and say, oh, that was always already the kind of thing that was.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. This is really
good, Jordan.
Yeah. In that God's power, this is what I was trying to say a moment ago with much less fluency, that God does not have something called power that is a potency that he at times employs and times does not.
He doesn't have an abstract power because nothing he does is abstract.
Right. Yes. That's good.
Because neither do we. Because
Right.
Yes.
My power as a parent or my power as a teacher, I'm either being true to that or false to that.
Right.
The moment I'm false to what it is, I'm abusing my power. I'm not using it, I'm abusing it.
Think about that. You can always evaluate it or be held accountable. And the one who simply wants power wants no accountability.
That's right.
Because power to do what? Right? None of your business. It's just my power. I just want the power. I love this line. It reminds me of it's Alistair McIntyre in his short history of ethics. He has a great line where he says, so many have always wanted to paint the masses with moral relativism or radical skepticism, but it's always been the pure monarchs that are the nihilists. And the point of it is because they just want power for its own sake. They don't care to what end or for what value. Switch all the values and slogans you want. They simply want to hold the power, even if they never use it for anything in particular, or if they use it for everything in particular that they want at whatever time. The unhinged power that's unhinged and undisciplined by the determinacy of love is the satanic.
Mm-hmm.
So could you just say that God just has truth, goodness, and beauty? He doesn't have power because it's just always actualized
his truth, goodness, and beauty is the power.
His power. There you go.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a huge shift. Like if we can make that, we come a long way. For sure.
Yeah, exactly. So then it leads to every. Sorry, Chris.
No,
go ahead. I was just gonna say that's what then leads like someone like a Gregory of Nyssa or like a Saint Isaac of Nineveh. I'll quote people that are canonized and have never been condemned. Those are the people that will say something like, what is the point of divine punishment? What is God's power? It's not that he doesn't have it or he can't punish or he can't be forceful, like you said. Mm-hmm. It's always just why, though? What is he trying to do? What's the exact thing? And like, look, we're not in the dark about what God is trying to do. He's trying to save everything he made.
And I mean, that's Ariugena, right? God does not punish anything that he has made. He punishes that which he has not made.
That's baller. That's good.
Like he doesn't punish. He corrects us. He punishes evil.
There was a deceptively simple comment that I actually think is worth mentioning earlier, and I think the person who made it in good faith. It was Anselman, Luke. It was a while ago, but
about how this isn't a scripture corner.
No. He made it. It was a very simple comment that he made where he said he acknowledges that God. He said God loves all of his children, but some of them hate God.
Yeah,
so
right.
The question I would ask to Anselman is that, well, what do those of his children that hate him, what do they think he is?
They're what hasn't been created yet.
Because
back
it
to
couldn't be the God that they hate couldn't actually be God himself. It would be impossible. Like there's no way that one could do that. So the only God that can be hated by some of his creatures is an idol. By definition.
I think that's right, but I do think there is another bit of wiggle room here, a wrinkle.
Go for it.
That is, it's a pedagogical point, which is, I think we all come to these conversations with different histories. I'm trying to think of and without because I don't want to over dramatize it, but I do think there's a way in which very, very often theology is an attempt to work out our biography.
Yeah, for sure.
We're to play on that line from Bart. I mean, we're talking about our own history, just using God's name to do it. And sometimes the resistance to all this is not about the theology at all. It's about the ways in which that code plays when you're actually talking about the personal life the history of the person who's at stake, whose life is at stake in the conversation. And so I do always want to kind of leave room for that in these kinds of conversations. Like perhaps what you're really talking about is something over here and we don't quite disagree. You just have to be discerning, I think, about could we get to that? Could we get to when you say this about God, maybe you're really talking about this in yourself, and that's worth talking about, right? So that sense of just this is a almost facile example, but I wonder if sometimes some of what's at play for some people when they're talking about the power of God is they're trying to find their own agency. Mm-hmm. And when they hear us saying, God doesn't have this kind of power, they're just not at a place at this point in their life where they can hear that without it feeling disempowering to them in some way.
Yeah.
So I think that's, again, you can't sort all of those issues, but the teacher in me is always wanting to say, there is another way to hear this, and I want to be as attuned to that as I can be.
Well, Chris, I see that. I hear that more.
That's good. And also, Chris, I'm somewhat at a disadvantage compared to the rest of the people in this conversation because I'm the only one who was always a universalist and was never anything else. So sometimes I can have like a real lack of understanding and lack of patience. Because it's something that's always seemed so obvious to me, and so when I can sometimes be less than fully patient with those who don't see it as clearly.
I never said anything like that from you, Nate. I'm just meaning in terms of the pace of the conversation. I don't think you're.
Yeah. No.
Well, and Chris, I want to say too something I really appreciate about you. I'm going to go old school evangelical, but your pastoral attitude and heart and all these things, because like it's so funny to me. Like I imagine, because I don't imagine you irritate a lot of people with stuff you say, and I feel like you and I say the same things all the time, and I irritate people. So like, and maybe neither is good or bad.
He speaks the language, Luke. He knows how to phrase it.
I mean, but that's what I mean. He's pastoral about it because I think that is true. Because usually when I approach these conversations, I had a little side conversation with Nate privately. I was like, I kind of do just go into logistician, just let's talk about ideas mode, even though I know in my head logically that that's not how people operate. When they're talking about God, they're talking about their own history to some degree. We all are. I mean, it's kind of unavoidable. But I just imagine we can say these things and you're not, and it's almost like I project and that, we can just have a conversation about the facts, but like, that's not how people operate, I
don't think it's virtue on my part. I think I'm lucky enough to have a lot of these conversations with people whose stories I know, sometimes when you're in online spaces and you don't know, like I'm just lucky enough that a lot of this has played out for me with, people I've grown up with or I've spent time with, and so I have a sense of that. But don't get me wrong. Like I got plenty of people who would like to see me silenced in one way or another. But I actually think the work of theology, it's so precious, man. I don't want to waste time fighting about it unnecessarily. Like if there are fights we have to have, let's have them. But man, I don't want to have fights we need to have.
Right.
All right. Well, any closing thoughts? I think we've been at it for an hour and a half. I think it's been a really rich conversation. Do we want to open it up to see if anybody wants to come in and ask us a question, or?
I want to share one reading.
Go for it.
I want to hear what you guys think of it.
Okay.
It's from John of Damascus, and it's his little work on heresies, which is hilarious to me because he's kind of working through just heresy, and some of them he's dismissing with a sentence, which is quite a move, right? It's just like one after another. But then he builds up to this point. And speaking of, like, if there are fights you have to have, let's have them. This is the way to do it, I guess. But listen to these lines from him. These heresies detailed above have been described in brief because, although they amount to but 100 altogether, all the rest come from them. So he's kind of cutting it all at the roots, he thinks. The Catholic Church has kept itself away from all these, as from so many pitfalls, and instructed by the Holy Trinity, it teaches rightly and religiously and cries out, "We believe in Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, one Godhead in three hypostases, one will, one operation, alike in three persons, wisdom incorporeal, uncreated, immortal, incomprehensible, without beginning, unmoved, unaffected, without quantity, without quality, ineffable, immutable, unchangeable, uncontained, equal in glory, equal in power, equal in majesty, equal in might, equal in nature, exceedingly substantial, exceedingly good, thrice radiant, thrice bright, thrice brilliant. Light is the Father, light the Son, light the Spirit. Wisdom the Father, wisdom the Son, wisdom the Spirit. One God and not three gods. One Lord, the Holy Trinity, discovered in three hypostases. Father is the Father and unbegotten. Son is the Son, begotten, not unbegotten, for he is from the Father. Holy Ghost, not begotten, but proceeding, for he is from the Father. There is nothing created, nothing of the first and second order, nothing of Lord and servant, but there is unity and Trinity. There was, there is, and there shall be forever, which is perceived and adored by faith. By faith, not by inquiry, nor by searching out, nor by visible manifestation. For the more he is sought out, the more he is unknown, and the more he is investigated, the more he is hidden. There's so many things about this that I like. I mean, obviously, we could take weeks with this, but I just want to point three things out and then let you respond to them. One is how much of our problem is we're having a cataphatic conversation without the apophatic correction. Right? I've been talking recently with exchanging emails. Talking is too strong a word with Andrew Louth about this very point. That and he's talking specifically, Jordan, about Maximus on the Trinity, and that we need those anaphoric, not this, not that, not this, not that, not this, not that, before we can have any kind of real conversation. He loves that line from Louth does, that the Trinity belongs both to the cataphatic and the apophatic. The doctrine of the Trinity does. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing I want to hear you talk about. The other is that right in the middle of it, he says, nothing of Lord and nothing of servant. Mm-hmm. Neither of those belongs.
Right.
Like, to me, that's critical, because as I try to argue in the sermon, what he does is come and he doesn't undo slavery because he serves. He undoes mastery, right, and undoes what mastery has done to service. Right. That, I think, is, I wish I had known this passage then. And the third thing is that just that sense of adoration. That I wonder if one of the things that bedevils our conversations about these things is that it's not adoring enough.
Yeah.
So I just love to get your reactions to those points.
No, I really liked it. And the thing that stuck out to me, because it's something that I find myself actually, Jordan's had conversations with him. I have a good friend of mine who's kind of part of this community that we're all part of. His name is Sam, and he's a Unitarian. And we have friendly arguments about the Trinity all the time. And that point about neither quantity nor quality is one that I continually go to over and over again. And basically, when Sam and I discuss the Trinity, it's not that he's very much that the Trinity cannot be tied to the Bible is very important to him. He still very much has a very sola scriptura mindset as a biblical Unitarian, and I freely admit that the doctrine developed over time. It's pretty obviously that that's the case, and so my tendency is to argue for it more philosophically, and I just don't see. So he essentially there's a lot of détente in our arguments because I'm not as invested in the kinds of arguments that he is invested in, and so we can have pretty amicable discussions. But that neither quantity nor quality one is one that I hit myself quite often, and also just beautiful.
So, Chris, my main response to that would probably be on your first point, I mean, I agreed with everything else. I thought it was all really great. But the first one, the switching back and forth between cataphatic and apophatic, I mean, this isn't a shameless plug for my live stream this morning, but this is what that was about. And it's about essentially like Jordan Hall, somebody's related to this little corner conversations. He has this idea of like paradigmatic mind to transcendent mind. And it has to do with right brain, left brain stuff too. But the paradigmatic mind is the one that has frameworks that just can't accept things because of these narratives that it's told itself. And then, but the problem is like you switch between framework, paradigm, back and forth. It's this binary thing. But if you do that fast enough, it almost becomes, the rhythm becomes a tonal thing, which is somewhat like transcendent mind. And I think this is all Barfieldian. I love Barfield. Barfield was like my beginning in this whole thing. And I think if we move toward this thing of like final participation, or I even call it iconic thinking, where you're not even the kind of non-dual things that you're saying in there just become no problem because you're not in this zeros and ones, light and dark thing. You know, dark is not dark to you. You know, and
Well,
so
also in terms of
yeah.
Barfield too, it's like participation, right? Participation is there's an inherent sense of movement in the idea of participation. It's not a things that are known through participation are not that when we were talking earlier about the way of knowing that it's like a dissection that renders things dead. It's precisely not that.
Yep.
Because it's in the thing. It's actively involved in it. It's participating in it. And so that's the way in which I would see that as Barfieldian.
I have two thoughts, Chris. One is more autobiographical, where I think it's just a constitutive of my personality, but every time I hear a challenge like you can't be this or that, I'm like, well, watch this, you know. Yeah, my family even got me a coffee mug that said like, oh, you know, you don't think I can watch this or something. Like had it made. So I grew up basically in a pretty anti-intellectualist context, a religious context that made me to feel guilty for wanting to pursue things to a great extent and depth. And with systematic approaching, you know, I grew up in a context that said any theology is an imposition on the Bible. I grew up in a context that said no creed but Christ. And I grew up in a context that was, you know, constantly saying that God's whole business in this world was to like put old looking fossils in the ground to test your faith, you know? So like, I always say like, I've had to like reason my way from quite the depths. And so like, I'm very, very unimpressed a lot of time. I don't know if that's the right word, but like, I'm not undaunted by, you know, some of the like quick quips that, you know, that people come. So I've always thought this. I've always thought, even before I read Hegel, I thought, if anything is true, it must be connected to everything else that's true.
Yes. Yep.
And so if there is some truth to be had in an analytic mode of thinking, there's no reason to choose to suppress that for the sake of some other mode. But it also, there's exactly for the same reason, there's no reason to absolutize that either.
Yes. Right.
And so I think probably agility is, and sort of or nimbleness, I think is what, you know, is necessary, because there are some people that I talk to, you know, like some paleo Thomist or something, and I need to be able to make the distinction between operative grace and cooperative grace and prevenient grace and sufficient grace and, you know, efficient grace. Like you got to do that. And a lot of what I do in like the Maximus book that I thought nobody was going to read, and I was surprised that they did, was because it was very scholastic. And I did that on purpose because I thought, you know, people are going to challenge my reading of this, obviously. So I need to make sure that it's as absolutely and utterly clear as I possibly can. And so like I wrote an analytic appendix, you know, so all to say, like, I've always kind of wanted to just do it all the best I could. And there's a lot of risks in that. The second thing is that I've really been thinking about this a lot lately. When Plato says that the one is the good, it means that the highest truth can't really be accessed without some degree of an aesthetic ability. Like there's
For
a
sure.
point. There's a point at which I mean, I know, like I guess what I'm saying is like there's a lot of like principles or slogans or tropes, not you guys, but like that I hear a lot. You know, the transcendentals are convertible or something, like the good and the true and the beautiful are all one and all that stuff. But I just think more. But what I've reflected on more is like, so then what sort of person can access the highest? And it has to be an integrated one.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when you first started talking, Jordan. The first thing I thought of was like that we need to be two-eyed, right? So Barfield in Poetic Diction, he talks about, you know, the way in which like our abstract thinking, he compares it to Odin sacrificing an eye on the world tree to gain the mystery of the runes. So like that we gain access to this power by learning to look at the world through one eye, and in the modern and the scientific age, we've looked at it through Tomberg makes the very same analogy. He calls it looking through the lower eye, right? Where we decide that we are only going to pay attention to the lowest things, because there is actually something that we gain from looking only at the lowest things. And he also, Tomberg is interesting because he says that the medieval theologians were also one-eyed, but they only looked with the higher eye and ignored the lower eye.
Mm-hmm.
So to bring it back to Luke's point about everything tying back to Barfield, that's Barfield's entire point, is that the move toward final participation isn't to pluck out the other eye.
Right.
It's try to restore vision to both eyes, which is
Yes.
So.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
Was your point, just to make sure I'm tracking
Yeah.
you don't want to read the apophatic and cataphatic as somehow chastening each other, like letting both have full reign? Is that what
it's like corpus callosum?
Yeah, I mean it's okay if they chasten each other. I just think I guess what I'm saying is that certain discussions and certain people will need the emphasis to be put at on a certain one or the other, or a certain way of configuring them. And like there's so I guess to make it really concrete, if I'm talking to somebody about my view of universal, or my own students, by the way, like half of which don't agree with me even after I'm done presenting it, which means I guess I'm a good teacher or a bad, I don't really know. But you know, it's one of those where it's like, to some people I say, all I need to say is, you know, it says that he goes after the one and he leaves the 99. It doesn't say he might get it. It says he gets it, lifts it up, and brings it back. Mm-hmm. And then other people, you know, I'd have to be like, you know, like deal with like the fixity of the soul metaphysically after death, you know. And so all I'm saying is that there's a sort of like, there's a way in which the way conversations unfold and what is emphasized has so much to do, I guess, with who's the participants, you know. And so wasn't making like a you know, like a statement about the method in general or something.
But Jordan, what if the one sheep doesn't want to go back though? Then the shepherd has to just say, "Sorry, I guess, sheep, I'll honor your wishes."
Happily, sheep are so dumb that whatever they think is never definitive.
I do want to give Sherry has joined us, my Grail Country co-host, the one and only Sherry. You wanted to come on here.
Yeah.
What do you have to say to us, Sherry?
I just wanted. Well, I was intrigued by by what Jordan was saying about dunamis, and it struck me when you were talking about it that's actually the whirlwind. God comes out of a whirlwind, right, to speak to Job, and then there's also the idea that the whirlwind could have been the dialogue that was happening with Job and his friends, you know, and out of that he comes, right? But either way, you have this image of something that spirals up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. I was just gonna go, Sherry. That's why I immediately like the shape of the whirlwind is the spiral,
And
and
that's
so it's
to me
like
what a
it's signaling the opening of the world.
right. And that
Yeah.
also is the image that pops up in my mind when I hear the word dunamis. I see this, right? Something that's dynamic is not moving in a straight line, actually. It's doing this, right? But anyway, I just came on to read a George MacDonald quote.
You know what, Sherry? Before you read that, I just want to say what you just said was like the most hippie Grail country crap. Just give us the truth. Back it up with some Bible.
I even knew
Jeez.
she was gonna do. I knew what she was gonna do with her hand. It's like
Spirals. Chapter and verse.
Give us the equations.
I'm giving
That's
you the inexorable love quote from George MacDonald.
Yay.
Nothing is inexorable but love. Love which will yield to prayer is imperfect and poor. Nor is it then the love that yields, but its alloy. For if at the voice of entreaty love conquers displeasure, it is love asserting itself, not love yielding its claims. It is not love that grants a boon unwillingly. Still less is it love that answers a prayer to the wrong and hurt of him who prays. Love is one, and love is changeless. For love loves unto purity. Love has ever in view the absolute loveliness of that which it beholds. Where loveliness is incomplete, and love cannot love its fill of loving, it spends itself to make more lovely, that it may love more. It strives for perfection, even that itself may be perfected, not in itself, but in the object. As it was love that first created humanity, so even human love, in proportion to its divinity, will go on creating the beautiful for its own outpouring. There is nothing eternal but that which loves and can be loved. And love is ever climbing towards the consummation when such shall be the universe, imperishable, divine. Therefore, all that is not beautiful in the beloved, all that comes between and is not of love's kind, must be destroyed. And for fun, because St. John says that God is love, I thought, what would this sound like if I replaced the word love with essence? So I'm just going to read that. Nothing is inexorable but essence. Essence which will yield to prayer is imperfect and poor. Nor is it then the essence that yields, but its alloy. For if at the voice of entreaty essence conquers displeasure, it is essence asserting itself, not essence yielding its claims. It is not essence that grants a boon unwillingly, still less is it essence that answers a prayer to the wrong and hurt of him who prays. Essence is one, and essence is changeless. For essence constitutes purity. And this to me is an alchemical view of what this might mean, right? Essence has ever in view the absolute existence of that which it beholds. Where existence is incomplete and essence cannot constitute its fill of existence, it spends itself to make more essential, that it may constitute more. It strives for perfection, even that itself may be perfected, not in itself, but in the object. As it was essence that first created humanity, so even human existence, in proportion to its divinity, will go on creating the beautiful for its own outpouring. There is nothing eternal but that which exists and can be constituted. And essence is ever climbing towards the consummation, when such shall be the universe, imperishable, divine. And I just thought that was an interesting little thought experiment to replace it with that word and to see it as an alchemical view of what's actually happening, because I think the alchemical is a good illustration of theosis.
Mm-hmm.
That's like, is that related to the comment that you made earlier about marriage being an image of apophatic? So, do you want to elaborate on that? Because that caught my attention earlier, but I didn't.
Well, because the whole story begins with a marriage and it ends with one. So I think we better, think about what that means, right? And
Right.
and I mean, it is the most perfect image of an alchemical process because out of it comes new life, right? So, yeah, a marriage will bring about a person. And I think God is in the business of making persons.
Mm-hmm.
No, that yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure who brought this out first, but Father John Bear talks about this a lot. That in Genesis, we don't quite have a marriage. We have the promise of one.
Mm.
What we have, I mean, in a sense, we have one. I mean, of course, God presents Eve to Adam, but it's not quite a wedding. It's certainly not a feast. And
No.
it's what we have at the end, right? And that the text says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, right? And of course, that's not how it was practiced. A woman left her family.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
To belong to the man and his family. And so this reading, we've been talking about it quite a bit in the open table circles, that in some ways that's a prediction of the whole of cosmos, that the son leaves his father and mother. And what I added to the conversation is that is incarnation. Jesus leaving his father and mother is the eternal movement of God. That's the kinetic aspect of kenosis, right? That the movement of God is from father and mother to us. And that, the cross is the moment he arrives. And this seems to be what Origen has in mind with what's going on when Jesus is talking to John and Mary.
Right.
At the cross. But I think it's interesting to think that we're in a sense, we're aimed at a wedding.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I also think that the other reason I wrote that in there, Nate, was because a marriage is a reconciliation in the best possible example of it that we can conceive of opposites. And some of the things that I like to think about in that regard are, I've always had the image of a marriage being like when you're putting together a puzzle. Mm-hmm. You can't put puzzle pieces that are the same shape together. They literally have to be the opposite shape, right? And when you find the two pieces, that fit together perfectly, you're filling out an image. And I think that's what, I mean, Eve came from Adam, right? They were one being at one time, and they were made in the image of God, and together they are again the image of God. And all of that language is used to describe, Chris, the final marriage supper of the Lamb, right? That Christ is the bridegroom and the church is the bride, and together they are making visible the invisible, the image of God.
Let me see if this works for you, Sherry. I'm trying to kind of linking this to the whole breadth of the conversation, the way we let it begin, and the way we proceeded. Let's say this. Let's say that power and love are two contrary ways of naming the essence of God, right? One is, and
well,
Let me
finish
my thought. There are two contrary ways of naming the essence of God, and that and which is why, as we said at the beginning, the idol of power is the idol of idols, right? Because because it's very persuasive for us to believe that that is the essence of God. But God reveals his essence to us as being not power, but love. So, and the way I want to connect this to what you're talking about here is that essentially, whether the image is power or love, the way that we exist as persons is still relational all the way down. The question is whether that relation is a broken one or a healthy one. And only one of those things yields to a healthy relation.
Yeah. I mean, whenever I perceive these dichotomies, I want to marry them, right? I want to reconcile them because they're seemingly opposite. And what is to me miraculous is when you can synthesize opposites, right? So I think that God's power is love, or God's love is power. And this is what the Force card is talking about, right? So power and love could be seen as a masculine and a divine masculine and a divine feminine attributes of God, right?
Right.
You could think about them that way. So, but because we sin in the sense that we really just don't get it, that's to me what sin is. It's not an ethical, moral, problem. It's an ontological one for me. So because we miss the point, we misunderstand power and we misunderstand love, right? But if we can marry them together, we can understand both of them. Because if somebody, how am I going to put this? If a human being, and well, Jesus did this, okay? He demonstrated the power of love, right? On the cross. And that love, that powerful love, created the world. And that's what powerful love does in a marriage. It creates the world to come, which is future generations, right? Those children are the future. They are the world to come.
That, for what it's worth, on my part, that's why I wanted to draw in that passage from Damascene, because I think there's a terrible little book by Paul Tillich called Power, Love, and Justice, I think, in which he's kind of modeling, I think, the worst way of doing all this, which is to take static concepts, power, love, and justice, and kind of try to think them through analytically without ever bringing in the cataphatic and the apophatic worship of the church that reminds us we're talking about someone here.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about Jesus, his mom, his father, Israel, the church, the cosmos. Like the moment we analyze the concepts free of that one, I don't think we're doing theology anymore. Like we're doing something else, right? So it's not a matter of we shouldn't be analytical about it. Of course, like let's be as speculative as we possibly can be. We just need reminders that what we're speculating about is someone's life. This one who left father and mother to be with us, and I think we're probably all on the same page there. But that Tillich is, I think, a good example of what not to do on this front.
Yeah, because literally the language we would use to describe taking those away from the person would be divorce. And, and I think that that's why God hates divorce. It has nothing to do with marriage. It has It has to do with the dichotomies that we continually produce outside of the mystery of the person, right?
Well, and back to like the point that I wanted to remember is what we discussed earlier, but Jordan was talking about, it's always power for something. So there isn't just some power, some inactive power. And so in God, it's always towards truth or goodness or beauty, which is under the auspices of love. You know, so like power, there isn't just like a generic power to even set in opposition to something. Like it's nothing, because then it's just potency without an actuality.
There's no generic love either.
No.
It's
That's right.
of God realized in this man Jesus and all those he's drawn to himself. And like if we forget that, like if love gets generalized, we're just as lost as when we generalize power.
Sure,
Right.
sure.
Right.
I think go ahead, Cherry.
No.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to touch on what Luke said about if we're in opposition to something, then that is not the power that God exhibits through love, because God would not be in opposition to anything, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Go
and
ahead.
I think, that actually leads well into what I sometimes like to say, that some people want God to be so powerful and sovereign that he's freed from the very debts of love that in Romans 13:8 he says we're to owe everyone.
Mhm.
There is such a thing as a debt of love.
Yeah.
But it's of course no obligation. Not in the sense of an external one, right? It's actually he says it's the fulfillment of the law.
Yeah.
In that same verse. And so our theologies can very easily, like where I see this connecting with the overall theme about God sort of not being a master in this sort of purely, anti-Mark 10 sense, is that God in so many theologies is most fundamentally indifferent towards everything other than himself. He might fortuitously want to grace you with a favor or two or three or all of them or none of them, but kind of whatever that is, including the outcome of your own eternal fate, is more or less a matter of indifference to his own bliss, his own goodness, his own ravishing and love, which is to say that he's objectified you.
Yes.
And is no longer apparently interested in persons, but in like abstract objects like mathematics or clumpy empirical objects like a rock. And
That's really good, Jordan. I'm gonna have to go back and I think you said it really well right there. Yeah.
And so, but what we're all, I think, getting at, what the conversation seems to come back to in different forms, which I think is really great, is that God is the best discharger of the debt of love because God is love. And he doesn't need or want to be freed from the debts of love, because that would be to destroy himself and deny himself. And so even though so many theologies can present themselves as if they are, again, pious and humble and doing diligence to the transcendent magnificence of God and the grandeur of God, what they're really doing is a species of rationalism, which has cut God off from the root of his own being. And there's really nothing laudable in that.
Yeah, that's why I love that George MacDonald quote so much, because he says, "Love loves unto purity." Where is that now? Love has ever in view the absolute loveliness of that which it beholds. Where loveliness is incomplete and love cannot love its fill of loving, it spends itself to make more lovely, that it may love more. And to me that just the way that he wrote that sentence, it's in the shape of a spiral.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a dynamis or a dynamis, right? It moves. You can't stop it. It's kind of like, why, what's that question from the movie where he says, well, why does he why does he have to run to first base? And the father says to his son, because he must. Right? You know, there was an interesting conversation in the corner recently. I think it's on one of your live streams, Luke, where people were conflating incense and chanting in the Orthodox Church with skinny jeans and lattes and smoke machines. I wanted to rip my hair out, but you know, the first thought I had,
Just your preferred flavor, man.
the thought I had was, why does a wolf howl at the moon? Because he must. You know, I've gone out to Nemaya, where my sister lives, for a First Nations version of Theophany, where the waters are being blessed. And what is present there? Drums, chanting, and smudge, incense. And it's because reality, God, the divine, the sacred, whatever you want to call it, requires that from us. That is our only response to it. So why does he chant, smudge, and drum? Because he must.
Mm-hmm.
And this is love loving unto purity to me, right? When we find these universals across the globe of human beings responding to God in the same way, it's love loving unto purity. It to me, it's the only kind of apologetics that makes any sense.
Right. Well, was there anything else that you wanted to add since you've joined us, Sherry? Or
No, I think that's it.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining this live stream, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, to everyone who watched. And I just want to open it up to if anybody has any closing thoughts. Go ahead and.
I thank you guys for doing this with us. This is fantastic. Something I'm trying to get better at is anytime I talk about these issues is I want people who disagree with me to feel loved too. Because I think, you know, you can, I don't know. I feel like one of my Lukeisms is, you know, you can be right and be wrong, or be wrong and be right, which is actually in a Bar Brothers lyric that Sherry shared with me. And so like you can be right in the wrong way, you know, and I don't want to be right about these subjects in the wrong way. And I don't know, but I'm also codependent. So when people get mad at me, I'm like, I must have messed up somehow. So I'm this worthless turd covered in God's white snow of grace. That's my final thought.
You know, one of the things, I won't get into detail because it's probably too much woo for people, but when I was 5 years old, I actually had a conversation with God, and he revealed to me that I was loved, that I was valued, and that I was a part of a body, and I got to see myself go there, not as a like person, but as a, I don't even want to say, because I found out it was anathema to describe yourself that way. In one of the councils, I was like, oh my God, really? but anyway, I saw myself going up to this body, you know, and it wasn't like formed like a human body. It was just a body. It was a unified, like a starling murmuration or something to that effect. And that's why I said earlier in the conversation when you guys were talking, I think a lot of people conflate worthiness with what it means to be valued, right? Because one of the things I learned through that experience was that I was actually important, even if I didn't feel important. I was only 5. Like I didn't even live a life yet. Like my memories were probably only a year long, you know. But I knew I was so important well, for me, the takeaway was the thing that is thinking about me thinking about dying doesn't die. That was my takeaway, right? And so it was like, I don't know how to communicate. I know words are so terrible sometimes because they fail so terribly at really describing the thing. Worthiness, like somebody would question me about it in the chat, and I said, well, are you your father's son? Because I think that's the image that we get in the scripture, right? Are you worthy of being your father's son? Does your worthiness make you your father's son? Can you become more worthy? Does that make you more of a father's son? This is a just is thing, right? And I like to think about it as valued, valuable to God. We're valuable to God. He values us.
Yeah, and there's a certain way, Sherry, of hearing like traditional Trinitarian language about the economy as that, right? That death just is the economy of God's life already including you, right? Already including the whole of you, right? So for you, it's a 5-year-old self with short memories, but for God, it's the glory of your person, right? And like that, I think there's a play there on economy and debt and value. That's what kind of taking to heart.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say, all of the negative, silly comments, just ignore them.
I'm enjoying some of them. Like this, this one by T-Grog was fantastic. Like we have 5 versions of Yahweh right here. It's like, all right.
No, actually, my favorite one of T. Grog's was actually, I want to highlight this because it's so funny.
I would say that's actually
he clearly didn't listen to Chris's sermon beforehand. Where is it? Right here.
Do your homework, T-Grog, before you come here throwing stones.
Where he said that God lacks that we're presenting a God who lacks self-sufficiency. I'm trying to find the comment where it's like, which is precisely the opposite. That's the antithesis of what we're saying. I'm wondering how T. Grog hears in what we're saying a God that isn't self-sufficient.
Well, I just want to say that I'm really happy to hear that we're 5 versions.
Oh, right here it is. Here it is.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I said, Sharon.
So God is not self-sufficient, not a Christian position.
Yeah, it's okay.
That's okay, T-Grog. We're not in an objective mode.
I can't find it right now because I'm incapacitated, but I will locate. There's a wonderful quote by Robert Jensen about God being a helix of love that you'll want to have handy whenever you're talking about the dunamis as the spiral.
Oh, it's cool.
Gorgeous. It's a gorgeous image, and I'll find it and send it to you.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. I want to go take.
Jordan, you haven't had a chance to give any closing thoughts yet.
Oh, I don't. Well, I just want to sit here and stare at Chris in pain. No, I'm just kidding.
I love you all.
Get out of here, Chris.
See you, Chris.
Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Be stoned in private.
I just got a quick one. I think it's related to what Sherry was saying. I think this for me is the beauty of theosis, and that we seem to think that our being can't ever be as important as God's because ours had to be given. But one of the things about the incarnation is that God, and Maximus says this all the time, God, he says at one point, God, the Son of God, he who is Son by nature also becomes the Son by grace. And he who is the giver also becomes the receiver. So that being a receiver no longer is a barrier to you becoming the one who also gives. So the kind of the depths of the solidarity that the incarnation effects at the heart of creation, and which is itself the logic of creation, in my opinion, makes it to where my phenomenological sort of experience of having to grow into a world and of being an idiot and of knowing nothing and of being afflicted by all these pressures and pathologies myself and the way people treated me, and that one person who said this one thing to me, maybe that's true, and all this negative self-talk and all these things, all those things, that's actually like, I think most people's default really is like, obviously I'm not that insignificant.
Mhm.
Obviously, right?
Mhm.
And then and so the beauty of theosis to me is that it's not, even that is a form of narcissism.
It is. It totally is.
Yeah.
This is Carl Sagan, you know, the little blue
Right.
dot.
The
Pale
small
blue
dude.
dot.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and he wasn't a Christian, right?
Right.
But he was still a Calvinist.
So it's, you know,
who would you say was still a Calvinist? He was a-
Carl
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 Sagan.
Sagan.
Oh, Charles Darwin.
Carl
Yeah,
Sagan.
I mean, there's a certain kind of default Calvinism that exists in both in this country and in Canada and in the UK. I think.
You know, I've always, Jordan, I don't know how you feel about this. I'd love, we got to talk actually, but I've always thought when God made us, he formed us from matter, right? From the clay, from the dust or whatever. But then he breathed his life into us, right? And so therefore, in my mind, it's his life we live.
right. Yeah, I had this. I had students today after class ask me. They were like, "Oh, so you know, Genesis 2:7, the breathing in there. Like, how is that? Like, if you do accept a kind of evolution of the cosmos, you know, I mean, like all this sort of stuff predated that, and you were saying like that this is kind of the human being comes sort of later. Like, how does that? When does that actually happen?" I said. I think it happens at the Annunciation. So it's going to be weird because that's when the Spirit comes, you know, but it's at the total ascent and the freedom. There's no other way that Spirit can be born except through Spirit. You know, Spirit is of Spirit. Spirit is born of flesh. Flesh is born.
Right.
And so the combination of those two, I was like, you know, Christ, I think, is the first full human being, and it's Christ, of course, right? That is, I mean, Adam is made as the type of Christ, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
And so, however you conceive creation unfolding and beginning, you know, it for me fundamentally, everything presupposes the facticity of Christ, the actuality of his life, and so the Spirit that was given to Adam is actually the exact same Spirit that was breathed onto the disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also the Spirit that was given up on the cross.
Yes.
And it's the Spirit that's brooding over the waters in Genesis 1.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's always that Spirit that is the one that's being given, you know? And so when he does that, I think you're right. Like he's already binding himself to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You are nothing at all without God, and so that's not lost. But after all, what you are is given as God.
Right.
Well, there's no like right. I mean, that's kind of like, I think that's why Sherry did her little language experiment with the word essence.
Right.
Is that she was kind of joining me out on there can really only be, I don't know, I actually, there can really only be one essence. Like, I don't really understand how you can get away from that conclusion. Like, I don't.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Well,
so I think that was why I understood you to be doing that thought experiment, is to kind of point out how and the reason we use love to refer to that essence as its name is because love represents a kind of unity that is not in competition with multiplicity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're talking about, like when we use that word love, like, and it's like you know, and yeah, so I'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, you know, I know that George MacDonald was also had an education in physics and chemistry, and so I imagined him thinking about this as a chemical experiment, right, and how chemicals bind to each other,
Mhm.
and that was also why I wanted to do it. And he's, you know, he says he uses the term alloy in here, and he says, and if we do it, you know, with my little, you know, tweak. Nothing is inexorable but essence. Essence which will yield to prayer is imperfect and poor. Essence which will yield is imperfect and poor. Nor is it then the essence that yields, but it's alloy.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, and this is why it loves it. This is why it loves unto purity.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is pure. Like it cannot be corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And so it's really interesting to think about it. Because when we hear love, I mean, that just conjures up a million different images in people's minds. What is love to everyone here? Well, you know, T-Grog thinks we've got 5 different versions of God. I don't know how many people are listening right now, but there's that many versions of love too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can make it an alchemical experiment, an alchemical thought experiment, I think it's easier for the imagination to see how love binds or remains pure, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it is an essential something,
Right.
and
I think Tigrar just heard you say alchemy and then tunes right out. That's what I think. But yeah.
Well, guys, I have to go.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. We should have quit a while ago.
No, it's fun. No, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I got a little drive home, but yeah, so
definitely. Thanks
Okay.
for joining us this evening, Jordan. Appreciate it.
yeah,
Thanks
of course.
Sharon, thanks for coming on at the end.
Bye,
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining
Thanks,
us.
guys. It's been great.